As the 80s rolled into its midway point of 1985, there were two things that had run rampant: sequels and slashers. The slashers are nearly too many to name: Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and Michael Myers, who all saw their first action, or would get the bulk of their sequels in the decade of the slasher. While most of these stuck to a very similar formula to continue to churn out profit as much as gore, there were a select few that deviated. Day of the Dead is kind of a sequel in name only, with the movie following the aftermath of the human race, but not any of the characters. It's less misunderstood and more ahead of its time. Elsewhere, we would be treated, and I use the term loosely, to both The Hills Have Eyes 2 and Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf. These aren't misunderstood by any stretch either. They're just not good. So we will look at two truly misunderstood horror sequels in A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge and Friday the 13th: A New Beginning on today's 80s Horror Memories.
Back in the 80s, they were fun. I mean, you would laugh, and they were a good time. And I think that that's something that I really recall about those movies then, is that even when people were dying horrible deaths, they were fun and you would laugh.
The sequel phenomenon isn't exclusive to the 80s. We would have sequels like Exorcist II, The Heretic, or Jaws 2 try to capitalize on the hype and success of their series' first films, only to be met with the law of diminishing returns. The 80s is where studios and the creators of these films really figured out how to churn them out regularly and make a profit enough to keep the cycle going. Friday the 13th would get its start in 1980, and by 1985 we would be on our fifth go-around with everyone's favorite hockey mask-wearing killer. While A Nightmare on Elm Street had its first entry come out in 1984, New Line Cinema realized the potential of not only the movie, but a startling new horror villain. First was Friday the 13th: A New Beginning, which would come out on March 22, 1985. It would make nearly $22 million on its $2 million budget, but that is also a steep decline from Part 4. So plans for a new 3-film series with its own villain and story arc were cancelled. The reason for this was the poor reception to what ended up being the movie's twist. See, it's not actually Jason doing the killing. The main character is Tommy Jarvis, played by Corey Feldman in the previous movie, and very briefly in a flashback here, who is off to a halfway house after multiple stints in institutions to try and heal him of his trauma. A series of unfortunate events leads to the death of an inmate, and Jason, or someone who sure looks like him, starts killing the other patients and anyone in the surrounding area. When it's all said and done, we find out that who we thought was Jason was actually Roy Burns, the father of the patient who was brutally murdered in the first part of the movie. To keep this under wraps, the film's creators didn't make it known that this was a Friday the 13th movie to the cast initially. By the time I was old enough to start watching these movies, it was via a VHS marathon courtesy of Video Unlimited down the street. I would rent 2 of them at a time and watch them a few times each to really soak in the kills and the nudity that everyone wanted to watch these for. Having the benefit of older brothers and hearing about the series as a whole, I was already aware that the killer in the 5th installment wasn't in fact Jason. I didn't know the whole story, and quite frankly, I didn't care. This movie had everything that I wanted after having mainlined the first 4 over a 2-week period. In fact, it originally had a whole lot more, but the MPAA demanded that the movie be heavily edited down to get an R rating. This also caused strife between producer Frank Mancuso Jr. and writer-director Danny Steinman, who fought over a lot of the production, with Mancuso calling Steinman a pervert and accusing him of making a porno rather than a slasher movie. Paramount gave Steinman a 2-picture deal, but a sequel to The Last House on the Left fell through, and this ended up being the last movie he ever directed. While the movie was not the failure that its reputation would suggest, the critical reception and fan reception of Roy Burns as the killer was abysmal. Only a handful of principal cast knew what the twist was, but everyone hated it when they were working on it and knew that it wouldn't work. They ended up filming a few scenes to explain further who Roy was, because they didn't expect anyone in the audience to piece together that he was the paramedic from the first scene. Roy would later get some love from fans, and even end up in the Gun Media-produced asymmetrical horror game, Friday the 13th: The Game, as a playable version of Jason. It's still divisive today, but when you boil it down to its parts, it's still very much a Friday the 13th movie. A score by Harry Manfredini, people being killed in the woods by a hockey mask-wearing killer, and to that point, the most gore and nudity in the series. Had the gamble of not using Jason paid off, we could have had a whole different set of movies following this one with the Tommy Jarvis character as the new series villain. Oh, what could have been. Friday the 13th wasn't the only franchise with a sequel that played with expectations. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge was almost a very different movie on top of being, well, a very different movie from the prior year's first movie. Robert Shea of New Line Cinema needed a hit, but also needed to cut costs down a bit. Originally, this led to Robert Englund being turned down for a pay raise, and an unnamed extra being put in a mask was then going to play Freddy. Can you imagine anyone else playing the character during the series' heyday? We would at least get a TV show and 8 movies with Englund in the role before the remake would try something new with Oscar nominee Jackie Earle Haley as the Byrne Dream Killer, while Halloween would wait 2 movies to try something different with its now classic Season of the Witch, and Friday the 13th would try something new in Part 5. The Elm Street series would begin to tweak the formula after only the first movie. Jack Sholder was brought in after he wrote and directed Alone in the Dark, which New Line also made. Originally, he didn't want to do horror, but looked at the landscape and realized it had the potential to put him on the map. This is another one that, when I first watched it, I more or less just saw it as another slasher movie, because I watched it immediately after the first one, and I felt that it was a lesser version of that. All the subtext and changes that were put in only dawned on me much later. I did remember feeling that Freddy was much more menacing looking in this movie, and that's thanks to Kevin Yeager.
Well, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is a strange one, and I don't like the film. I'll say it, and I think that again it was over the top, and it was such a departure from the first one from a tone standpoint. When Halloween 3 came about, it was so vastly different that you accepted the tonal shift. You accepted the fact that Michael Myers wasn't in it. This felt like a tonal shift, but it had the same ideas. It still was kids falling asleep. It was still Robert Englund. It still had that thing.
But the movie was again a success, making just shy of $30 million on its $3 million budget. It's also known as the only film in the franchise with a final boy rather than the traditional slasher final girl. In fact, when you look at horror in general, it's incredibly rare for movies to go against that trope. The movie character here is Jesse, and he and his family have moved into Nancy Thompson's house on Elm Street. The movie ties the story back to the original in a couple of ways, predominantly by having Nancy's journals found and her nightmares similar to those that Jesse's having, Freddy included. Instead of just Freddy taking out the children of Elm Street, he's trying to possess Jesse and make him kill for him before entering the real world to cause more havoc. Freddy's Revenge feels a lot darker when watching. While Freddy wasn't in his silly phase yet in this one or the first one, he at least toyed with the main characters in a somewhat comical way, even if it was a disturbing kind of black comedy. There is nothing like that, or the outright comedy attempted in later films here. His makeup, especially his eyes and demeanor, are played strictly for terror. That being said, looking at it through adult and more seasoned eyes, you see exactly what made the movie kind of contentious at the time, and even slightly divisive now. Whether you call it subtext or in your face, the movie focuses on homosexuality and some of the unique trials and tribulations that the LGBT+ community has gone through. While some of the cast and creators claimed not knowing anything about it for a long time, One of the actors who immediately saw it and embraced it was Robert Englund, who embraced the fear that it would elicit in certain audience members.
One of the subgenres is gay horror, and I think that maybe I didn't understand it at the time when I first saw it. I think that's it, and so now I respect it as something that is a culty-like film. I think when I first saw it, I was not expecting it to be as vastly different from the first one as it was, and so for me, it'd be an interesting one to rewatch now. It's a weird one for sure.
It took a lot of time and a lot of open discussions from star Mark Patton, who at the time of filming was not openly gay yet. But eventually, the screenwriter discussed using a lot of the ongoing homophobia to craft the script. Patton also went back and forth on his interpretation of the script versus following every word and action that he was given. It is Robert Englund's least favorite Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but not for anything discussed so far. He agrees with Wes Craven that the character strays too far from the rules set up in the first movie. It is striking to watch, particularly when you first discover this wonderful series of movies, just how different the feeling is for this one compared to the first. While it does go in a much darker direction for the character of Freddy, it is also largely like something out of a different slasher series based on how many new and different things Krueger can do. At the midpoint of the decade, horror was still trying to find something different with its movies. We were treated to all of the major categories and then some. Sequels and certain trends, particularly slashers, had to make the movie stand out while keeping the elements that brought in bucks. We all had favorites too. You would go to the theater or rental store multiple times to see the one that you considered your favorite, or at least really rewatchable. But if it didn't resonate with you, then it could be a one and done. If the movie didn't bring anything new to the table, it ran the risk of being too generic or been there, done that. On the other side of the coin, if it strayed too far from the tried and true formula, it could alienate its existing audience and kill a whole series or idea. Friday the 13th: A New Beginning has been one of my favorites since I first saw it. It delivers everything I'm looking for in that particular franchise, while also having a sleaze to it that's almost endearing. I applaud it for trying something different, particularly after the previous movie was subtitled The Final Chapter. While it still has low rankings and elicits anger from parts of the horror community, it has come a long way in its public opinion. Not quite as far as Freddy's Revenge though. Not only has that movie become a big cultural piece for horror in the gay community, and given star Mark Patton almost icon status as the self-titled first final boy, but it regularly shows up in people's lists of their favorite Freddy outings. While 1985 has some movies that were big at release and still maintain that status today, like Fright Night, The Return of the Living Dead, and Reanimator, it also had its fair share of sequels that came out and tried new things. While some of those, like the previously mentioned Howling sequel and the Hills Have Eyes follow-up, still don't have their big argument to attain that classic status, today's double dose of slashing was simply misunderstood. They offered that great mix of the same but different that had people being conflicted when they first saw them, but enough intrigue to keep bringing us back to discuss and dissect. The debate will rage on as the next generations go back and watch these and their respective series as a whole. Sometimes it just takes time. And like our featured killers, the ability to never stop trying.
On the next episode, we sink our teeth into the vampire films of Life Force and Fright Night. Until next time, gore hounds.
Hi, friends, your humble narrator Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.